When we think about the Commodore Amiga, there are two great aspects of that machine for me. Now naturally, we've got the amazing games, which, if we're being honest, probably sold the majority of the 5 million or so systems that were sold during its decade on the market. But outside of the machine's impressive graphics and sound, the Amiga has always been respected for its operating system. A lightweight OS that could actually be run from a single floppy disk, featured true preemptive multitasking, was highly modular and extremely efficient. And since the Amiga's parent company Commodore went bankrupt in 1994, there have been many efforts and projects designed to improve and extend the life of the Amiga OS, including spin-offs to other platforms like the PowerPC-based MorphOS, which essentially gives us a modernized Amiga-like OS that can run a lot of the original Amiga software, but we have things like modern web browsers and email clients, and you can run it on faster hardware such as PowerPC Max. And we've also got AmigaOS 4.1, which is a similar attempt to take the Amiga OS to faster hardware and runs on highly specialized custom and very expensive systems. We've also got AROS, which for the last 30 years has attempted a clean room rewrite of the Amiga OS for standard PCs. And we've even got new versions of the classic operating system that you can run on your old Commodore hardware. And of course we've got FPGA solutions and very powerful emulators for most modern systems. And even by the time Commodore went bust in April of 1994, the Amiga's 68K processor range was looking quite long in the tooth, and Commodore were looking at transitioning the Amiga range away from it, with HP's PA RISC platform forming the basis for their sadly never released next-generation Ombre chipset. And of course, around this time, Apple moved away from the 68K and onto the PowerPC platform, which around that time in the mid to late 90s did seem like the logical successor to the 68K, although outside of Apple's systems, it never received mass adoption in the desktop PC market and tended to be more expensive than the increasingly dominant x86 and compatible CPUs. And around this time, many Amiga users had a bit of a chip on their shoulder, no pun intended, about the PC as a platform, seeing the system as inferior hardware and singing the praises of the superiority of the Amiga OS over Windows and MS-DOS. And actually, it was quite common to see the Intel outside slogan on Amiga users' desktop wallpapers in the mid to late 90s, as they attempted to shun the platform. But obviously by the early 2000s, it became very clear which direction the market was going. If you wanted cheap, powerful hardware, the PC was the platform that had won. In 2001, the company that owned the Amiga were moving the system towards the PowerPC-based Amiga 1 machine. But Amiga fan Bernie Mayer saw the direction the industry was going and decided to do something about it. And his solution was called Amithlon, an amalgamation of the words Amiga and Athlon, talking about the AMD Athlon processor. And it allowed you to turn a standard PC into a powerful, fast Amiga. Now, of course, by this time you could already emulate the Amiga on Windows using UAE, but Amithlon is actually a much lighter and faster solution. And it uses a small customized Linux kernel that then boots directly into AmigaOS 3.9. And this makes the emulation feel transparent, as it fully takes over the PC, and it can access the PC's hardware. It's got just-in-time emulation, and Amithlon doesn't feel like an emulator at all. It actually feels like a really fast 68K Amiga with a graphics card. And you can access the PC's network interface, the USB ports, the optical drive, and Amithlon can run x86 code alongside 68K code under full control of the Amiga OS, combining and switching between them really quickly. Now, Amithlon doesn't emulate the Amiga's custom chipset, so that means games and hardware banging demos are not going to work on here, but most productivity software will. And this was designed for the more professional Amiga user, not gamers, and the hope was that this would lead the way to having more Amiga software and eventually the OS fully x86 native. Now, Amithlon was packaged alongside another emulator that was launched on a small QNX install called AmigaOS XL, and this was released commercially by Hagen Partner in the year 2001. And unfortunately, shortly after release is when things started to go very wrong. Now, in the time-old Amiga tradition, the lawyers got involved and the project was killed. Now, Bernie actually did an interview with an Amiga newsletter to tell his side of the story shortly after, but to cut a really long story short, Amiga Inc., who owned the OS and the Amiga trademarks, and Hagen Partner had a falling out over licenses and payments, and Bernie got caught in the middle. Now, deciding that this wasn't worth the stress and possible lawsuits, he withdrew from the project. And sadly at the time, he was working on a major new update for Amithlon called Umulator, which never saw the light of day, although he did detail what improvements it would have had on his website. Basically, even more compatible and optimized, but the legal threats killed any enthusiasm he had left for it, and he left the Amiga market. And Hagen Partner, realizing that having lost the main developer, Amithlon was pretty much dead, they stopped selling it shortly after. So it is a bit of a tragic what-if story, and to be honest, another classic tale of Amiga self-destruction, but the package is still out there, mostly forgotten about on the internet. Now, in the past, I'd heard that Amithlon was quite complex to set up, but there is a fantastic website I found from SNK Bitten, which walks you through the entire thing. And for getting hold of the software, well, obviously, abandonware isn't technically legal, but you can find the Amithlon files without too much trouble on a certain archive website. And of course, I own the licenses for the Amiga Kickstart ROMs, and I did buy AmigaOS 3.9 back in the day anyway, so we should be all good. And this video is brought to you with my friends, our sponsor, PCBWay. Now, I'm sure you know about PCBWay. They offer fully featured custom PCB prototyping, low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and if you're looking for someone to do quality 3D printing and injection molding, they've got you covered. And I'm sure you're aware that PCBWay are massive supporters of the retro community. Have a look at the shared project section on their website and get an instant quote for yours right now at PCBWay.com. Now, of course, this software dates from the early 2000s, so I thought for the least hassle, we'd install this on period correct hardware. So I've got this Pentium 4 machine with 1GB of RAM, which I think is actually the maximum that Amithlon supports. We've got a Matrox graphics card in here, an IDE, CD-ROM and hard disk, and onboard audio, USB and Ethernet, which may or may not work. Now, of course, dealing with hardware from this period, we're going to install the entire thing off CDRs. So I burnt a few of them, and the guide will tell you exactly what you need, but in short, 4 disks here, one with FreeDOS, which is an open source alternative to MS-DOS that is still in active development and aims to be highly compatible with MS-DOS and should be perfect for setting it all up. We've got the Amithlon kernels, and the community have actually made some newer ones in more recent years and drivers for newer hardware, which might be useful. And I put a better file system on there called PFS, which we'll use later. And we have the Amithlon and AmigaOS files on here too. So that should be all we need to get this system set up. Okay, so the install process of Amithlon is actually quite straightforward and should only take a few minutes once you've got your head around the guide. But I'm going to walk you through a really basic install just to get you up and running. So the first thing we're going to do is to boot the PC from the FreeDOS CD that I burnt earlier. So from the menu, we're going to press number 1 to continue to boot FreeDOS from CD-ROM. And then we want to boot into the live CD environment, which will give us a basic FreeDOS install running out of a RAM disk, which will be enough to get the hard disk partitioned and to get FreeDOS installed. And actually partitioning the hard disk is the first thing we need to do. So we'll type in xfdisk. And we need to partition this drive into 2 parts. Now, partition 1 will be a small PC-DOS partition, which will just be used to boot the PC up. And then the second part of the drive will contain all the Amithlon and the Amiga files. So the first thing we'll do, as you can see here, we've got an 80GB drive that is completely unset up at the moment. We'll press enter on here. We'll do a new partition, primary partition, and this one, as I mentioned, is only for FreeDOS, so we'll make it really small. 20 megabytes will be enough for that, and we'll do that at the start of the free space. And then it will ask us if we're planning on using this partition for installing DOS or Windows. Now, we're going to be installing PC-DOS, so we'll say yes to this to initialize it. We can say no to that one. And now we've got our C drive, at 24 megabytes actually, ready to install PC-DOS. Now, the rest of the drive we're going to use for the Amiga and Amithlon files. So obviously you can set this up to whatever size you want, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to use the entirety of the rest of the disk. So we'll do a new primary partition. We'll use all the space here. Now, we're not going to be installing DOS or Windows on here, so we'll say no. And as you can see now, that partition is hidden. So we're going to change a partition type from this menu to other. And the type we need for the Amiga is 76. And again, we'll say no to initializing that. We're not going to use it for DOS or Windows. And that is pretty much all we need to do from the partition wizard here. So we'll press F3 to write the partition table to the drive, and then we'll give the machine a reboot. Again, leaving the FreeDOS CD in the drive. So we'll do number 1 to boot back into here. Number 5 from this menu. And next, we need to format our C drive ready to install PCDOS. So we'll type in format C/sys. From here, we've got to do yes. You can't just type Y, it's got to be the full word, yes. And now we're ready to install FreeDOS from the CD-ROM drive. Now on this machine, my CD drive is X. So I'll type in dir. We can see the FreeDOS directory is on there. So what we need to do is copy the files to run FreeDOS from the CD-ROM over to the C drive. So we'll type in this command, copy x/FreeDOS/setup/odin/star.star, and we'll copy all those files to our C drive. It'll probably ask if you want to overwrite anything, just say no to that. So now that FreeDOS is installed, the next thing we need to do is to get Amithlon up and running on here. So we'll swap the CD. I've got my Amithlon disk in the drive. So if we go back to X, you can see that is in there now. And the files that we need to copy are located in the ISO Linux directory. So I'm going to CD into there. Now we need to copy all of the GZ files from here. So we'll do copy start.gz to C. We also need to copy a file called small over to C. We'll copy Amithlon to C. And we'll also copy a program called loadlin.exe to C as well, which is a program that we need to basically launch into the small Linux environment that Amithlon uses to boot. Now, I did mention that there are some newer kernels that have been developed in more recent years, so we might as well put those on as well. So as I mentioned earlier, I burned them to a separate CD, so I put that in the drive. We'll go back to X. And as you can see, I've got kernel 3.10 and kernel 4 in here as well, so we'll copy those over to my C drive. And that's it. Now we have got some config files that we just need to change if we want to use these newer kernels. Now, depending on what hardware you're using, you may have more luck with kernel 3 or kernel 4. For the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to stick with kernel 3. So we'll do edit, small. And as you can see at the start of here, we've got emubox.gz. Now this is the original 2001 kernel that Amithlon ships with, but I'm going to change that line to use kern 3.10. So we'll save that by pressing Alt on the keyboard, go down to save, and then down to exit. And we're going to do the same with this config file called Amithlon. We'll change that to kern 3.10 as well. And again, save that. And now we're ready for our first boot into Amithlon. So to do that, we'll type in loadlin at Amithlon. That will launch that config file that we've just edited to allow us to install it onto our hard disk. And we see the nice boing ball animation, and then we should land on the Amiga workbench. And this is where things start to get a bit exciting now. We've landed on the AmigaOS workbench here from the Amithlon setup environment. Now, we haven't actually installed Amithlon yet. This is literally a virtual environment to allow us to install it onto our hard disk. So to do that, we're going to go into this Amithlon HD disk here. We're going to go into Tools, and then we're going to go to HD Toolbox. Now you'll see there are a few devices here. I'm going to select Amithlon.device, the first one. And it will show us a few disks in here too. Now this bit is really important. You'll see the hard disk is listed twice. So that's our 80 gigabyte drive in here. We do not want to select the first option from here. If we do, that's going to wipe out the entire hard disk, including that PC-DOS partition that we just made. So that'll mean you've got to start all over. The one we want is the one called Vert Disk 1. So we'll press that, and then it'll ask us if we want to install it. We'll say OK. We'll just press install on there. OK again. And now we need to partition this drive. Now, obviously it's entirely dependent on how you like your system set up. I mean, by default, it gives you 4 partitions. Usually when setting up Amigas, I just like 2. So I'm going to delete these ones here. We'll do delete partition and delete partition. I like to have one to install the operating system on, and then another partition to put all my files on. So I'm just going to drag out this little arrow here and use the rest of the disk for the second partition. Now, because we're going to be installing the AmigaOS files onto the first partition, we want to make that one bootable. So we'll press the little bootable tick box here, and then we'll do save. And then it will ask us if we want to write that to the disk. We'll say OK, and then we'll press on exit. Now, we're going to need to do a reboot here for those changes to make effect. Now, what you need to do is press reboot, but also quickly, after you've done that, hold down both mouse buttons. I'll show you why. Reboot, hold down 2 buttons here. You see Amithlon doing a soft reset. And then we get the Amiga early startup control. So go to boot options. The reason we need to do this is because by default now we've formatted those hard disk partitions, but obviously we haven't installed anything onto them yet, so we don't want to boot from that just yet. So instead of VDH0, which is the partition we just made, we want to boot again from the virtual disk that allows us to set up Amithlon again. So we'll do HDH0 here, use, and then boot. And that will take us back into this setup environment. And now we should see a couple of ghost hard disks appear on the workbench here, ready for us to format them. Now I'm going to go to the menu, do format disk. We'll name the first one system. I've got this set up to use the Amiga's default fast file system, which isn't great. I mean, I'd suggest you use something like PFS instead. Obviously the guide can talk you through that, but again, this is just for the purposes of a demo. So we'll do a quick format here. Okay, that one's done. Now the second one, format, I like to call this one work. And again, we'll do a quick format. And now these disks are ready for us to install AmigaOS onto. So I just need to change the CD-ROM over to my AmigaOS 3.9 CD, and then from here, we just run through the installer as you would on any other Amiga. Set the installer so it installs on the system partition that we just created, and let it do its thing, really. Set your options, and then AmigaOS installs really quickly anyway, but on this machine, absolutely flies. Then when it's done, we just take the CD out of the drive, give the machine a soft reboot. Now we do that by holding down the 2 Windows keys on the keyboard and Control at the same time. And in a couple of seconds, as you can see, we've now successfully loaded Amithlon from our hard disk. And that's it. You've got a basic AmigaOS 3.9 install up and running on a Pentium 4 PC. Now, of course, after this, lots more that we'll want to do. Install updates, drivers for things like 24-bit graphics, your sound, networking, USB, and of course your programs as well. But as you can see, we've got the basic system installed in just a few minutes there. But what does Amithlon actually look like when it's fully configured and set up? Well, funnily enough, here's something I prepared earlier. And this is a build of Amithlon based on CaffeineOS. Now, CaffeineOS is a distribution of Amiga programs that are all set up and pre-installed, and there are versions of this available for different systems, including the PyStorm for emulation, and this build that runs on Amithlon. Now, just to reiterate what I said earlier in the video, abandonware isn't a thing legally, and I've got to admit this does contain a lot of previously commercial software, most of it though from the 90s, most of it not available to buy anymore, and in fact most of it from companies that don't even exist in 2025. But obviously use your own moral compass there. The only reason I'm showing this is to give you a demo of what a properly, beautifully set up version of Amithlon looks and works like, and running this saves me around a month's worth of installation, getting everything up and running. So as you can see, we've got a beautiful 24-bit high-resolution screen mode here with some gorgeous icons, and we've got a start menu down the bottom that we can launch our programs from, and a dock next to it as well, and also the Amiga's premier file management program, Directory Opus. Magellan is installed out of the box on here as well, which is very nice. Now, the question most people, I imagine, want to know is, how much quicker is running Amithlon compared to a standard Amiga? So we'll go into the old school benchmarking tool that everybody recognizes if you're a fan of the Amiga. We do have sysinfo on here if we go into the benchmarking directory. Now the thing is, I did mention before that Amithlon can run classic Amiga software providing it doesn't need the Amiga chipset. Now the thing about sysinfo is it actually forces itself to open in a classic Amiga screen mode, which this system cannot handle. But luckily, there is a way around that using a program called Mode Pro. So what we can do here, we can actually force the screen mode of sysinfo into something that's more compatible with this system and my capture card. So I've upgraded that to 1280 by 800. We'll save that. And now if I double click this, there is the classic tool sysinfo. Admittedly very small, so if I zoom in, we can hopefully get a bit of a better look at what I'm doing. Now the thing that we really care about is the speed benchmark. So if I click that, it will then compute this system speed and compare it to some of the classic Amiga models. And there we go. Now as you can see here, it's actually compared this system to an Amiga 600, and it works out that we are 1,164 times faster than an Amiga 600. So I think you'll agree, compared to using a classic Amiga, this definitely has quite a bit of grunt. And yeah, sysinfo has sussed us already. Comment virtual Amiga? Yeah, technically. So yeah, if you were interested in the sysinfo benchmarks, and the kind of speed you're going to get, even from a Pentium 4, as you can see, wipes the floor with any of the classic Amigas. And as I mentioned, there are a bunch of classic Amiga programs already pre-installed on here, so I'll give you a quick demo of some of them and show you how well they run using CaffeineOS over Amithlon. We've got Final Writer, which was a word processor I used to always use as a teenager. This and Wordworth were my two go-to programs for doing school and college work. And we can open some of the templates from here as well. Even my scroll wheel on my mouse is supported, so if you wanted to, you could write letters using Amithlon with some old school Amiga software, running very nicely in here, and a much nicer screen mode than you would have got on a classic Amiga 600, for example. One thing that definitely wasn't possible on my Amiga back in the day was running MPEG video. Now, even on the Amiga CD32, you needed an MPEG video hardware card to decode MPEG video, but on here, we can just double click one of these included movie trailers, and as you can see, Amithlon playing this video really smoothly, not even breaking a sweat. We've got a Finding Nemo trailer here, and as you can see, running very nicely in a window on my workbench. So again, another big advantage of running this over a classic Amiga. Definitely couldn't do this on my Amiga 1200. And speaking of graphics, one thing that a lot of people used to do on their Amigas back in the day was 3D rendering. Now, I was never very good at 3D rendering. I do remember trying it a couple of times and having to leave my Amiga on all day while I went to school and then getting home and having a very simple scene rendered after about 12 hours. But on here, running one of the classic Amiga 3D renderers, Cinema 4D, as you can see, even dragging the wireframe around. No latency at all, really. I remember that would take so long to redraw my Amiga when I was a kid. So yeah, definitely that extra CPU power for things like 3D rendering, really useful. And another quick demo to show 3D rendering running under Amithlon is Misty Cube, which does some real-time rendering of a cube that is texture mapped. Again, something that would run very slowly on a classic 68K Amiga, but running very smooth on here. And we can even try out some of the later Amiga games, like this one. This is an FPS game called Genetic Species. They came out in 1998. Now, this is probably the nicest looking FPS on the Amiga, and this needed a pretty beefy system back then, so you'd want something like an Amiga 4000 with a graphics card to play it at a decent frame rate. But as you can see here, it's running very nicely under Amithlon. Now, it has been a few years since I played this, and it looks like I haven't found any ammo yet, so I'm probably going to die quickly. But if you were curious about those later Amiga games that maybe you didn't have the hardware to run back then, a lot of them play well on here. But most classic Amiga games that don't need a graphics card are sadly a different story. Now, they rely on the Amiga's custom chips, which Amithlon doesn't emulate, so usually you're going to be out of luck. And to be honest, if running games and demos is what you want to do, you're much better off using something like the fantastic Amiga Forever emulation package. Running that on a modern PC will play pretty much everything, or even getting hold of something like an A500 Mini. That said, there is an old port of the Amiga emulator UAE available for Amithlon, and it can run games in that environment with varying degrees of success. Now, this is one of my all-time favourite Amiga games, and probably my favourite pinball simulator. It's called Slam Tilt. As you can see, it is chugging on this machine. Now, bearing in mind this is only a Pentium 4, but if you want a good example of how well they can actually run, the creator of CaffeineOS is called Captain LeChuck. He's got some great examples of running classic Amiga games and demos on his channel and some of the more demanding PC ports. Now, he's using a faster PC than me, a Core 2 Duo running at over 3 GHz, and he also demos some of the nice RTG PC ports running very nicely on there as well. So if you want to check out more about that, I'll link his channel in the video description. So that's been a look at Amithlon, a really ambitious project that sadly was pretty much dead on arrival due to the legal battles back then. But in an alternate universe, this really could have opened up the AmigaOS to the power of cheap standard PC hardware. Now sadly, I didn't get to use Amithlon when it came out back in 2001, but having played with it today, I can honestly see why some Amiga fans described it as magic, reading the old reviews. Rather than the PowerPC route that the next generation Amiga systems ended up taking, we could have had AmigaOS running on cheap, powerful hardware and then transition the system to fully running on standard PCs. Now obviously that doesn't mean it was guaranteed to take on the dominance of Windows or even the Mac. There have been other operating systems that were ported to the PC that didn't exactly set the world alight. BOS is one example that springs to mind. Very capable, technically brilliant, but failed to gain any real traction. But for Amiga fans, it would have allowed a lot more users to step into the next generation of the platform, and there would have probably been a lot more powerful software designed especially for Amithlon, rather than just running the old 68K programs. Sadly, legal battles meant it never stood a chance, and today it's really little more than a curiosity, although a very capable one and definitely worth a try. So I'd love to know what you think. Could Amithlon have given the Amiga a second lease of life, or do you think it was always doomed to fail? Please leave me a comment and let me know. Plus, if you enjoy my videos here on YouTube, just a little reminder that I do a weekly retro tech and gaming podcast called The Retro Hour. New episodes released every Friday, and we interview industry legends and bring you up to speed on the week's top stories. And actually, we've just started doing video for that podcast as well, so you can check out the YouTube channel or find us on your favourite podcasting app. And while you're here, here's a couple of my other videos I think you might enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.